Hello and welcome back to the Double Loop Podcast, your source for everything about fingerprints. Welcome all you fabulous fingerprint family. We'll talk about comparisons while you're doing your comparisons. I'm Eric Ray.
And I'm Glenn Langenberg.
And welcome to episode number 9. Been going for a couple months now, and thank you for sticking around. Tonight looks like we got a hodgepodge of material to cover, reviewing some discussion from the past couple episodes, and talking about just a variety of topics tonight.
Right, exactly. But before we start those, Eric, how was your week?
Oh, it's been pretty good. My two trainees just went to their first introduction training, so they came back all fired up and ready to hit the ground running. They did pretty well.
What course was that?
It was Ron Smith's introduction course.
Okay.
I can't think of the exact name off the top of my head.
Is that the one taught by Mike Campbell?
That is the one. Okay. There was mostly 10 print examiners in the class, and they've only been at it for about 6 weeks now. But they were kicking some butt. They were all the kind of competitive exercises in the class. They were finishing right up there at the top with the first people done. So I was really proud of them.
Oh, good to hear. Very good to hear.
And yourself, Glenn? What have you been up to?
Well, actually, this week we are doing our internal ASCII lab audit.
Ooh, fun.
So this whole month we've been going through that, and actually, I really, it's a pain, but I enjoy it because one of the things I really like. I don't know about your lab when you guys go through these types of audits, but we typically will audit other sections. So it's not uncommon for the latent print examiner to audit, the DNA section with a DNA analyst, or the tox section or something like that. So I think it's always a great opportunity to look at other sections' SOPs and ask them questions, and I always find it fascinating because a lot of big issues to us, things that are obviously very important to us, or things that we have lots of discussion about, like conflict resolution or bias or blind testing. You go and talk to, a toxicologist or a DNA person, and they look at you like you're from the moon. It's very interesting, and these aren't the types of questions that they're being asked about in the courtroom or having to deal with. So I found that pretty interesting, and for me, I actually went to our Northern Satellite Lab to audit although for me it is now my section, the drug chemistry section up there. But down here in St. Paul in the main lab, we had a toxicologist come over to audit the drug chemistry section. So it's been a lot of auditing, a lot of case assessment, and very intriguing.
Interesting. We got through our internal audit a couple months ago, and went pretty well. I mean, there are big discussions, I guess, as a group that they've, we're kind of interdisciplinary issues come up, and we had a couple of those this time. But we haven't gone to that where you have a different unit coming in. What we'll try to do is get someone from another lab to come in, since we have 4 labs to audit. Right now, we're ramping up to get ready for the actual ASCII lab audit, which is coming up middle of January for us. So we're already in countdown mode.
Next year. So just out of curiosity, when people have come in, are there major things, and I don't mean major findings, but just suggestions that you've heard or anything that's come up that, you thought was interesting, or, gee, we hadn't thought about that in that way? Anything come to mind?
You mean from our other labs coming in to offer things?
Yes.
No, because it's other labs, but they're all still within our lab system. When we get kind of more of an interesting discussion on this is when we have a statewide peer group in Arizona where all the accredited labs and a few other crime labs that aren't accredited yet meet to discuss these kinds of things. And it's always interesting to share the different labs' approaches and what the auditors have come up with in each of the audits that they go through. So most recently, it's been Tucson PD's issue with, they had an ASCII lab finding related to erroneous exclusions, which obviously is a topic interesting to me. They appealed how ASCII lab wrote up that finding and won that appeal, and it got kind of bumped down to a suggestion in looking at how they they word their protocols. The other interesting thing is seeing it was Mesa PD going really heavy into planning before the auditors come in with I'm blanking on the term that they use, but it's basically going through and ensuring that every point in the ISO standard is addressed. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's a term for that.
Is it a form, or is it like the audit trail, or?
No, it's geez. All my friends over in Mesa are gonna just be like yelling it out as they're listening to this, because I know they've been focused, spending a lot of time on doing this for the past couple of months. But it's just looking at every ISO standard and then basically getting this big chart of listing this is the ISO standard, and for each unit this is the point or the line in the protocols where this standard is met. Where we don't have that list available. We write up our protocols to meet the ISO standard, and then we've always assumed it's up to the auditors to find in our protocols where that standard's met. But they've just taken kind of a different approach to that. So it's
Sure.
It's an interesting way of interesting approaches to cover everything that's been coming out that we have to meet.
Well, in talking about multidisciplinary things, two questions, or I guess a comment and a question. First, I thought I would share with you, because of your interest in exclusions, and we've talked before about how exclusion decisions can be one of the more difficult decisions, because with an identification, it's different because you have found it, but with the exclusion decisions, you're searching and you're searching and you're searching, and you're not sure if it's there and you're missing it, or it's some other thing, or for whatever reason. The exclusion decisions can be a little more difficult.
Exactly.
Well, in my discussions with drug chemists, I was very surprised to hear that they have very much a similar issue.
Really?
That when they get a peak, they can identify it pretty quickly. They have found something to identify. The issue is when they don't detect something, are they missing it? And that was the question that kept coming back was, well, did I miss it in the extraction? Did I miss it in the instrumentation? Am I not sensitive enough? Is there something there, but my technique that I'm using is not going to pick up on it? Should I use a different technique? So I thought that kind of thinking about things and them describing how, and they kept referring to the word of an exclusionary process, when they would go through their instrumental techniques. I thought that was just absolutely fascinating and had such a great corollary to what we were talking about, that and they were even and they even used the phrase, well, how much is enough? Have I looked enough for this?
Right.
And at what point does it become a witch hunt where you are just looking for something that may not be there?
Right.
And so I thought the way that they were thinking about was absolutely fascinating, and obviously clearly, we can kind of relate to that a little bit.
Yeah, no, that is very interesting. I have that on my list of things to pursue, is going through each kind of unit in the crime lab and having a discussion with them on how this kind of pertains to them. So exactly like this for the drug chemists. But I'm sure in every unit there's a point where you have some sort of negative result, and there's some ambiguity as to what the reason behind that negative result is, and how further do you need to go to ensure that it's an accurate negative result. It's a very interesting question for all parts of forensic science.
Right. And then the other thing was a question for you. We've had some discussions in our lab and other places about DNA and whether or not DNA is done, before or after latent print processing.
Yes.
So, I know in our laboratory, the latent print work will come after DNA. DNA always gets it first, then it goes to latent prints. And we in the past had done some research to determine, with touch DNA, what their effectiveness of getting a full profile or partial profile with touch DNA is. And frankly, at least in our laboratory, before processing, their success rate was very, very low. I mean, they had a few quote-unquote shedders that were better than others, but for the most part, their success with just handling an object, touch DNA, was very minimal. And then after processing, it was even less.
Right.
And then when I've talked to other agencies, I was shocked to hear that a lot of times they'll do full latent print processing and then later do the DNA work. And so, and as I recall, your lab might be. Where are you guys with that?
Not quite. We don't. That's a rare case when it goes in that order. Typically, the way we'll work is if it's a serious crime, a person crime, violent crime, we'll have a latent print person and a DNA analyst in the room at the same time when the evidence is opened up, and they discuss kind of what's the best way to proceed. The DNA analyst will take their swabs right then, and then they package up their swabs and leave the evidence for the latent print analyst to continue with the processing. For your general property crime, everything falls to the latent print examiner. So the latent print person will open up the evidence, take the swabs, and then continue on with the DNA processing. Hasn't helped our latent print backlog, but the DNA backlog is even bigger, so that's kind of the decision that the administration's made at this time on how to proceed with all that. Rarely, what can come up sometimes is if it's an area where DNA and latents would both want to look for fingerprints or take swabs from, what we'll sometimes do is superglue the item, take photographs of whatever prints come up with superglue, and then the DNA will kind of know where to swab. They'll take their swabs directly from the fingerprints or from underneath where the superglued prints are. And but that's, I can only think of a small handful of cases where we've gone kind of in that order.
Well, as I recall, there might be some other other laboratories, agencies in your area that do actually process first, and I think
Mesa was one of them, because I think they did some research and into finding profiles after latent print. We haven't gone down that road because our latent print processing lab isn't set up to handle things at a contamination level for DNA.
I see.
So basically, once we start with latent print processing, there's a chance of cross contamination from DNA of previous cases, say. Once we start with latent prints, in just the general case, we want to make sure that that DNA has everything that they need for that case. But
right.
I think Sandy Siegel just had in her email list, had this question go out and came back with a wide variety of answers of how different labs are approaching this in all various ways.
And our laboratory is one that basically will not touch it post latent print processing. I mean, citing essentially that their protocols don't take into account the type of contamination, from superglue and dye stains and those sorts of things. So our laboratory actually will not do post DNA after processing.
It's new having all these everything working together, and we've seen the requests coming in from the officers just skyrocket over the past 5 years as to how many cases they're requesting DNA, touch DNA on, and everyone's kind of struggling to adapt and keep up and work through all the cases.
Yeah, and I guess that's their decision. I mean, I don't work in the DNA lab, so it's their choice, and that's just what they've done. That's how they do it. So okay.
Now let me ask you this, Glenn. I'm not sure how familiar you are with your DNA unit up in Minnesota, but do they have different limits on what they'll process in a case, or how do they approach cases with lots of items?
Yeah, they do. They do limit the number of items that they will accept. I don't recall the exact numbers, but yeah, I believe that they will only examine a handful of items in these different cases. Right. In property crimes, I think in crimes against people, they might have a triaging approach. These items first, then these items, and these items. But they definitely limit how they which items and how many items they will process for latent prints. And there's a number of, for DNA. And there's a number of cases where they simply won't accept the items except for extenuating circumstances. For example, they don't do like smoking devices, bongs and meth pipes.
Yeah, our lab just does not do any DNA processing, any DNA work on any drug case. I guess the approach that they have to take, again, not in a DNA unit. just for the amount of time and expense it takes with going through all those samples. While with latent prints, powder's cheap. I'm not sure about you guys. We don't really have any kind of limits. We'll basically process whatever we're asked to process in a case.
Yeah, I think we have some discretion where we can stop at a certain point, and in this type of case, say, well, we've processed X number of items, or we processed these, and I think we have some leeway, in what we will take. But again, like you say, it's case by case basis.
Yep, that sounds very similar.
Okay, so I think we have some other things to get to.
Yeah.
One was a comment that we had on a previous podcast, and I'll have to find that comment here if you don't mind. It was actually from Christoph Champeau, who had left a comment on a previous podcast. I believe it was on podcast number 7. It was the Swigfast one that we had just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, that was a very popular podcast. I was happy to see the numbers from that one were through the roof. So.
Oh, good.
We'll have to go back to that topic at some point here.
Sure. Well, the comment that he had was, I'll just read it here. Glenn, you mentioned about 1 in 30 identification conclusions coming back from verification for review in your agency. Do you have any data regarding other laboratories? Here in Europe, based on the few laboratories I am visiting as auditor under 17025, the rate is much lower, for right or wrong reasons. Any source for other data? So when I read that, I thought, wow, that does seem a bit high. And then I looked a little bit some data, and then thought about a little more about my answer, and maybe it was a little too off the cuff. Because I think for identification decisions, I think we'd be closer to about 1 in 50 identification decisions result in, maybe a sufficiency discussion or a consultation, and there might be a kickback on about 1 in 50 identification. I think 1 in 30 conclusions overall is more correct. So maybe I was just speaking too quickly or not thinking about what I was, which conclusions I was referring to. But I think 1 in 30, if you included some of the inconclusive and some of the exclusion decisions, but probably 1 in 50 identification decisions. On the most part, I don't see as much disparity on those types of decisions, and again, if it does, it comes down to just a sufficiency thing. Whereas I think you talked about maybe one of the other podcasts that you don't have as much difference of opinion between examiners with the exclusion decisions, because you guys have sat down and talked a little more and understand your criteria for exclusion decisions. Is that about summing up?
Yeah, so we still get those coming back occasionally. I guess it's a little hard to say because we haven't gone through and collected the data yet like you have, but just kind of estimating from working there, I'd say for exclusion or inconclusives, about 1 in 20 to 30 come back with questions, either, hey, can you just explain your thought process behind the conclusion that you reached, all the way to, hey, I think you should change this inconclusive to an exclusion or an exclusion to an inconclusive. For IDs, 1 in 50, anywhere between the 1 to 30 and 1 in 50. And usually, again, it's hey, I see what you're seeing here, but I just want to hear your explanation for this part of the printer. Something like that. Much rarer to see one come back saying, hey, I think you should be inconclusive on this.
Yeah, and again, to Christoph's second point was, well, do you have any data for other laboratories? And the answer is no, the short answer. The longer answer is, it really depends on the complexity of the latent print. In the advanced ASB class that I teach, ASB applications, I deliberately give more difficult cases, and we often see in those types of cases differences of opinion from laboratory to laboratory. If this person's opinion in class is even remotely, representative of, how the person might give an opinion in casework, and that's a lot of ifs there. But, if in some of these complex cases, I see a wide disparity of opinions, and it can be 50-50 on some of these. I think for me the big indicator, and I think the most recent FBI work showed very similar things as well, that when the average, the mean perceived number of minutia is approximately 8, And so that doesn't mean that there are 8 minutiae there. That's just the average. If you gave it to 10 examiners and on average they saw 8 minutiae, those types of latent prints have about a 50-50 inconclusive identification rate. Because, of course, if the average is 8, then you've got a number of people who are much higher than 8 who have no problem identifying this if they see 12 or 15 or 16 minutiae in agreement. But if the average is 8, then you also have some that are at 5, 6, 7 minutiae who would be unlikely to identify it. So I think, again, the consistency rate amongst examiners is going to, fairly predictably go down as the number of available minutiae are decreasing. I think we've seen that in a number of studies now as well.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, and it makes sense that would happen. I point out, though, that in that advanced ASV class, and then also at the FBI, where they're doing blind verifications on these, that may be a little bit different than a standard verification. The rate that would come back from there, because even in your advanced ASV class, I'm not sure if you would see as much disagreement, because all those examiners are approaching it as the initial examiner. The disagreement may drop if it was an initial examiner verifier setup instead of all as initial examiners.
Yeah, I mean, I get your point that acting as a verifier, there could be a different approach, although, again, that begs the question, is the verifier giving their own opinion, or are they, and I'm not suggesting that you were saying that you or anyone else does this, but I think what we're dancing around here is that is it the verifier's opinion, or is it I can live with the initial examiner's decision and support it in this case?
Right. Or even when it comes down to those 8 minutiae, and even the same examiner, given the same comparison on different days, would 50-50 go with identification or inconclusive. When it comes down to just that borderline sufficiency question and it's a coin flip, then the verifier may decide that there's sufficient information to demonstrate that the initial examiner came to a valid conclusion, a supportable conclusion. I guess not disagree with the answer given. So I guess that's kind of what you were saying, just phrased a little bit differently.
Yeah, sure. All right, well, should we take a break here?
Yeah, let's take a little short break, and we'll get back to the rest of our Hodge Podge discussion on different things. I think we'll head up with a news story next. Stick with us, and thanks for listening to the show. We'll be right back.
Hi, this podcast is brought to you by Elite Forensic Services. Elite Forensic Services provides quality forensic services by distinguished forensic professionals. We provide expert consultation for prosecution or defense, criminal or civil, on forensic cases and specialize in fingerprints, DNA interpretation, bloodstain pattern, and other types of forensic evidence. We can also provide customizable training and SOP development for your agency. Check out EliteForensicServices.com for upcoming training courses and workshops. Thanks, and back to the show.
Welcome back to the Double Loop Podcast. Glenn and I are going to continue on with this episode, looking at a case coming out of England. There always seems to be interesting and controversial cases coming out of the UK. Maybe it's something in the water up there. But this was the Susan May case, and there's been some discussion the past week or so on the CLPEX.com website, and it's been all over the news, especially on the BBC. Essentially, though, what happened here is Susan May served 12 years in prison for murdering her aunt, and that happened in '93. And she's been appealing to overturn her conviction, even still, now that she's been out of prison for a few years now. And what this came down to is that Susan May's fingerprints were identified at the crime scene, and they were claimed all throughout the trial to have been made in blood. And this news report that just came out from Ari Zeelenberg, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Glenn, did I get that right?
I think that's pretty close. He tends to go by Zeelenberg, I think, but yeah, it's pretty close.
And well, his report said that there's no evidence that the fingerprints were made in blood, but were comprised of sweat and minor residue of an unknown substance. And even going back, I think in the initial trial, if I'm reading this right, there was a report or a letter that stated that the test on the fingerprints did not indicate blood. Basically, there's more to the story of the police, ignoring other leads and not following up on other possible suspects. It looks like from that these fingerprints and the fact that they were made in blood, or at least presumed to be made in blood, by the prosecutors and the jury, were the evidence that put Susan May in prison for 12 years. Now that this is coming out that it's not in blood, the whole conviction is now being questioned, and she's gaining support to have the conviction overturned.
Just out of curiosity, in your lab, if you see friction-ridge detail in what might be blood, how do you report that? Do you report the phrase apparent blood? Do you write bloody patent print? What kind of language would you use when reporting that?
Generally, I'll put in my notes that it's apparent blood, but that doesn't go out into the report itself. That would be a serious crime, violent crime. We would have the DNA analyst opening up this evidence with us and doing those presumptive tests for blood, and then those results would go out in their report that whether or not it was blood. But for us, I'll make a note of it in my notes, but since I'm not the one doing that test for blood, I'm not putting it out into the report.
I see. Yeah, I know that there are some agencies that will call it a bloody print if they get a reaction with amido black or Kumasi blue or leucocrystal violet or any of those types of dye stains. And I always am a bit nervous about those types of conclusions being reported where a latent print analyst is basing it off of essentially a presumptive test.
Yeah, and this all goes back to our discussion about a month ago or so on the importance of that additional information about the print, about whatever comparison you're doing, and what to include and what not to include, whether the position of the print on the item has anything to say or to add into the conversation. So kind of anything else with the Susan May that you wanted to cover?
No, I was just picking up on what a great segue you had.
Okay, well, thank you. I kind of ruined it there by asking you if you had anything else. But no, I did want to segue right into an email that we got from Melissa Lyman. So thank you, Melissa, for writing in. And she had a couple of cases that she wanted to present as examples of this same subject of the position, the circumstances around the print, and cases where those had some bearing on the trial. The first one that she talks about was a federal drug case, and one of the suspects claimed that she had no knowledge of what was going on, that if she ever had touched this digital scale, that it was just incidental contact and a casual touch, and she had no idea what was going on with all these drugs. But in the notes was they detailed out that some of the prints that they identified to the suspect were identified on the on and off button and on the tear button for the digital scale. And during a pretrial meeting with the prosecutor, so again, pretrial meetings with the prosecutor would be a good thing. I wish some of my prosecutors were listening right now to go over these kinds of things.
You wish they were listening.
I wish they were listening.
That would be such a dream.
In any case,
much more likely is that your defense attorney is going to be listening.
Exactly. But that came out in that pretrial interview. Then the prosecutor was able to ask the questions in trial to get specifically to the location of these fingerprints. And, not saying anything about how they got there, why they got there, but that's just additional information for the jury to consider, that these fingerprints weren't just found on the scale, but specifically on the on-off and tear buttons of the scale. Now, a similar thing I had a few months ago. I was processing a digital scale in a drug case and noticed a print kind of peeking out from kind of underneath the weighing part. So, you got the main body of the scale with the batteries and everything, and then the big kind of dish on top where you actually set the things. The print was kind of in between those two parts. So to kind of get a good picture of it, I started disassembling the scale, took off the top part where you put whatever you're weighing, and there is this full-on beautiful superglued print underneath that the scale that you could only get to if you had taken the entire scale apart for fixing it or whatever. Just another instance of, this case, I have no idea whatever happened to this case. It never actually went to trial, and I'm not sure if the defendant was claiming a casual touch like in Melissa's case, but definitely a similar kind of thing where the location of the print would indicate that it wasn't just a casual touch of having lived in the same house as this scale.
You just reminded me of a case I had. It was years ago, but the defendant was actually acquitted because of that information. All the prints were on the scope of a rifle, and I think it was supposed to be a felon in possession of a firearm charge, and maybe a few other things with that. But at some point, it was discussed that all the latent prints were found on the scope, and none were actually found on the rifle, at least no identifiable prints to the defendant. And so I believe his argument, or at least the way the defense was asking those types of questions, I think ultimately was that the scope was detached from the rifle at some point, and he may have handled that. They're not disputing it, but that doesn't actually mean he came in contact with the actual firearm, which would have showed the charges. And he actually, in the end, was acquitted on that.
Huh.
So, I hadn't thought about that till you were just talking about your incident, where it went the other way for the defendant to an acquittal. Right.
The other case from Melissa came from a homicide where the victim was abducted while getting into her own vehicle and then was driven off and then later killed. And evidently it was a well-known fact that this lady kept a bottle of Febreze under her seat. The Febreze was found in a different location other than where it usually was.
You may want to tell for our international listeners what Febreze is.
Sorry,
Febreze is... We have a nice little following in the Philippines. Okay. They may not have Febreze there.
Well, Febreze is basically it's like an aerosol can to air freshener, or to spray on fabrics to freshen it. It's basically like a baking soda in a can that you to spray on things to remove odors.
An odor negator.
There you go. But when they processed the Febreze can, they found and identified the suspect's fingerprints on the trigger with the index finger, and then on the kind of appropriate spot on the can, the middle ring and little fingers, all on the can, kind of where you would put them if you were spraying down the car with Febreze. So, not going to kind of the intent of what was happening, but definitely it was a point that the person with these fingerprints was using, or at least holding the can in the way that you would use it, possibly to spray down and get rid of any odors in the vehicle. I guess, again, some follow-up of some interesting stories and cases where this extra information would be helpful in some way for prosecution or defense to the case. Just things to document, maybe not necessarily always go out in the report itself, but important to have in the notes and available for everyone to review and weigh the importance of that extra information.
Excellent. Okay. And again, thanks, Melissa, for sending us in that question. We hope more listeners will send us email or comments or stories as well that we can share.
Yeah, send all those to glenn@eliteforensicservices.com. Even if it's just to say how much you love the show, or to suggest,
or how much you hate the show.
Yes, we can't discriminate against that huge following as well. The people that listen just because they can't stand it. But send in ideas for the shows. If you want, we can even give you a call, and we can record you asking your question and put you on the air. You can be another part of the Double Loop podcast. One more little thing I had from a past show to follow up on this Hodge Podge episode. Last episode we talked with Steve Everest about Photoshop, digital imaging, and all that kind of related stuff. And that got me thinking the past week, because I often do this. Just my mind just runs and runs on whatever topic is rattling around inside there, and started thinking about how some labs will record the steps that they used in Photoshop, or the steps they use to enhance the image in the metadata that's attached to the image. That's a feature that you can turn on and off in Photoshop. I've seen and read about cases where that's not the most secure. That's not a secure part of the file. So just something for the labs that are deciding to go that way. Not that it's a bad way to go, but just being aware of the limitations on the security of recording your steps in that way. Just be careful and aware of that there might be limitations to this if this is the way you're going. For those who are all about metadata and digital imaging and are just nodding your heads along going, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, Eric. To that one guy, hopefully, maybe.
Yes,
that
that one guy. Steve, probably.
Steve. So, all right, well, Glenn.
Actually, Eric, there was I was just thinking about something, and maybe just a useful thing that we could mention for listeners. Sometimes there is discussion about when dealing with images, and they're making changes to the images. And some of the language that we use, I've heard, alter an image, manipulate an image, enhance, I think that was the word you used, was enhance, which is a fairly neutral one, or improve the image. But if one of the words I like to tell students is process. You talk about digital image processing as opposed to digital image enhancement, or I think the worst thing is digital image manipulation. I mean, it just has those connotations, whereas processing is like any other evidence. You hope to improve, the visibility of the images, and you hope to make your examination life easier by processing the image further. So I always like to try to tell students, use the word for digital processing, or as you said, an enhancement.
Yeah, and that's processing. I like that term. That's because that's a very similar thing to what we're doing when we process to make a latent print visible. We're just using digital computer tools to that same end in making the ridges and the furrows, to separate them on a color scale so that we can more easily see what's going on. Maybe that's another whole episode at some point. Boy, that might be even a little too techy, is getting into descriptions of how exactly levels or the different tools and functions available in Photoshop and other software work, and how to describe that to a jury. But who knows? Maybe.
Well, as a matter of fact, I saw a presentation in Phoenix at the II last year on that. One of your local examiners from an agency there. I won't say her name, but we should maybe go and talk to her and see if she'd like to come on and discuss. Because that was exactly the nature of her talk, was how to describe, not only for examiners, but how to describe what I'm doing to a juror so that they don't think I'm quote-unquote manipulating an image, but simply, as you put it, increasing the contrast or making it more visible or simply easier for your brain to process the image.
All right, well, anything else you wanted to cover here in our little hodgepodge of all topics, great and small?
There was something on COPEX from posted by Boyd Baumgartner, and he had mentioned 2 Economist articles. And I actually liked reading The Economist as well. There's a lot of cross-cultural topics and some very broad articles, but usually fairly well written and researched. And for the last decade, they've taken an interest in some forensic things and forensic topics. The 2 that he's talking about are Trouble at the Lab and How Science Goes Wrong. And they're basically a summary of some of the recent findings and articles that had made some national papers about how a lot of scientific papers have certain findings, but the findings are either not reproducible by another entity of some kind, or when they do attempt to reproduce them, they're simply not able to. They're not able to show that this is a repeatable thing. They're not able to essentially some of the hypotheses that were tested, perhaps were not shown to be true.
Right.
And that it's commonplace in a lot of literature because of the culture of some of the academics and some of the publish or perish, or if I don't publish on this or have show results, I'm going to lose my funding, I'm going to lose my job, and so it talks a little bit about that culture and so forth. So I happened to read those articles. He made a comment that people reading his post should go back and read an article. In fact, I'll just he basically said, that being said, I'd be interested in people's opinions in a critical rereading, which is funny because that would imply that people actually read this article as opposed to now a rereading of it. The need for a research culture in forensic sciences, which was authored by Jennifer Mnuchin and a number of individuals, myself included. David Stoney, Max Hauk, J. Siegel, E-Tail Drawer. There were a number of Simon Cole. There were a number of critics, academics, forensic practitioners who had come together and written this article as best as we could to try to find some common ground on the need for research and understanding the value of empiricism and data collection as opposed to relying solely on training and experience in some of the pattern evidence disciplines. And we made a lot of analogies to evidence-based medicine, that there was a time when doctors would prescribe certain things and say, well, this is just in my experience, in my training, the right way to treat this, as opposed to using evidence to guide, data to drive their decision making and offer to the patient the best treatment based on the data. So there's a lot of analogies to that. I actually like the articles that he was referring to, and it does show the danger of publications and some research just taking it on blind faith. I'm not sure I see entirely the connection he's trying to make to the article where the need for a research culture in forensic sciences. I'm not quite getting that. Maybe he'll post more on there. But I was just, if we were to take some of the recent studies in Fingerprints and apply these articles to those, for example, the FBI black box, FBI white box, Cedric Newman, Christophe Champeau, I'm an author on the NIJ sufficiency study. If we look at some of the recent work that's come out, we look at some of the Australian work that's been done, I actually find that a lot of that stuff is verifiable and reproducible. That if you go back, if you just look at the variability of fingerprint examiners going back to Ian Ebbett in 1995, he noticed it then. Every study that's come out since then has shown, a wide range of variability with fingerprint examiners selecting minutia. When it comes to decision making, when they're relatively easy, you've got almost no or close to no errors. When they're more difficult and more complex, or you've got close down matches, you start to see more and more errors. And I think that those results have been very consistent amongst the FBI group, I would say, people I've worked with, and then different Australian groups. So you've got people halfway around the world who are coming up with really similar error rates and data and findings that you're finding here in the States, at different levels. So I found that passes the test, so to speak, these articles, that these findings have been produced over and over and over again by different groups. I don't know. I just thought that I thought that the post was great because it showed two interesting articles. I'm not sure where he was going with the correlation to the need for a research culture in forensic science paper.
Just offering maybe a guess as to kind of where he was headed is that, just going by what you described, because I haven't had a chance to actually read through these yet, but in that, like you were saying, instead of when an article comes out, taking that, the results of the article just on blind faith, just at face value, looking more critically into the methodology behind that research, maybe having that research background with your forensic scientists so that they can review what research has come out and offer, whether it be the courts or their own lab, an informed perspective as to what the data in this research is actually saying. The first thing to pop into mind would be some of the things that E-Tail Drawer put out with his bias study, where his research did demonstrate a potential for bias in influencing fingerprint examiners away from an identification, but the research really wasn't there to demonstrate a bias towards an identification. So maybe that is a kind of where this was all heading. Is it's important to, no matter what the study is, whether it is the black box or research from more of a critic side of things, to take a look at how the study was put together and what the data is actually saying, instead of just accepting whatever is said, just whatever, which is kind of the way that newspapers usually go. Is the newspapers will read the headline, the title of the article, maybe the abstract, and then write a whole article about bias in forensic science, or the newest thing for this, or the all sorts of different things, without a full understanding of what that article is saying.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that that's that's what we're supposed to do. Is we should look at these research articles with a critical eye. That's why I was so confused. He picked an article that wasn't a research study. It would pick an article that was an opinion piece and didn't have data or a method to scrutinize. So it was just an odd selection given all the research that could be looked at and scrutinized. Why pick an opinion piece? So, but otherwise, I would agree. I would agree.
It's funny. It's only kind of tangentially related to this, but I'm a big fan of a TV show from the UK called QI. It's on one of the BBC channels. It's like a quiz show, kind of, but with really obscure questions and facts that no one will know the answer to. And the fun thing is just watching these comedians try to guess their way through these really obscure things. And the most recent episode that came out had this interesting thing where they've gone back and re-examined all the facts that they've put out on the show. And the show's in its 12th season or 11th season. It's been on for over a decade now. And what they found is that there's this kind of a decay of facts. I'm using air quotes here. And going back to the very first season, 60% of the facts that they had as little segments in the show are now shown to be wrong. Whether it's that science has evolved and people have a more complete understanding, or that the research that they originally did 10 years ago was flawed. And they even said how in the medical sciences, when doctors in medical school, half of what he learns will be wrong in 10 or 20 years. And,
that's fascinating. That's very fascinating.
Yeah. So it's this, I think, this disparity between our natural urge for there to be a right and a wrong, a fact, a truth, and science's approach where you never get to 100%. You never know for sure. You're always evolving and updating your knowledge with further research. Now that there are, honestly, more scientists getting involved in this discipline, I think that's an important thing for all of us in all parts of forensic science to understand, and to bring that into the courtroom, where they're very much a right or wrong, yes or no, black or white mentality. And as we bring in science into that, there's going to be this clash, because that's not something that science can necessarily provide.
Yeah, that's a great point.
All right, well, I think we've kind of exhausted everything that we had this week.
I think so. Oh, hey, do you have anything coming up? Any upcoming workshops or classes you're teaching?
Well, actually, in a couple weeks, Penny Deckent and I are going to be up in the Salt Lake City area for the Tri-Division Conference. So if you're planning on heading in that direction, look for us there. We'll see you there. We're going to give our kind of a conference version of our workshop on exclusions. Yourself, Glenn?
Yeah, I've got 2 classes coming up, Advanced ACB Applications. One in Decatur, Georgia, December 9th through the 13th. And then another one just outside of the Denver area, January 13th through 17th. If people are interested in signing up for those classes, they can either email me directly, go to the website, eliteforensicservices.com, or through Ron Smith and Associates. I mean, either one of those places. So hope to see some people there. We'll have these types of discussions and more in those classes.
Oh, yeah. If there's one thing that I love to talk about, it's Fingerprints, and people have a hard time stopping me from talking about it, even when they want to just relax and talk about something else.
They can just turn off the podcast now. They can just shut. They can push stop now, Eric. They can turn you off.
Oh, I keep going. Well, thanks for joining us for another week at the Double Dip Podcast. As always, if you have anything you want to share with us, send us an email, glenn@eliteforensicservices.com. Or even just go to eliteforensicservices.com and check out all the stuff that we've got there. Still working on the web page for the Double Dip Podcast. I'm hoping to get that up in the next couple of weeks. In the meantime, have a great week, and we'll talk to you again next Tuesday. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.